Sophie van Balen will give this lecture today. Short introduction about her. She is lecturer humanities at the Erasmus University College and academic researcher at Erasmus School of Philosophy. Next to that, she is head of the program board at the Philosophical Café Felix and Sophie in Amsterdam. The theme of her research project is the politics of air. She tries to develop a politics of air pollution and breathability in face of ecological crises. To this end, she brings together foam theory by Sloterdijk with a new materialist, more than human politics of care. In 2019, Sophie van Balen organized the 4th biennial conference in performance philosophy, intervention, intoxication, exclamation mark. That's a really nice title. And she was guest editor of the subsequent journal issue. So welcome again, Sophie. We're very happy you're giving this lecture and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will share. Thank you and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by thanking SWIP and in particular Trijsje Franssen for this invitation. I feel honored to give this lecture, this second lecture in their academic lecture series, especially because I'm a researcher that's really only just starting, but also because I felt I didn't really fit the idea of someone who was, you know, a woman philosopher studying women philosophies. And then after accepting this invitation, I started recognizing that I'm really looking into a lot of women philosophers, and that I'm also a big fan of feminist theory. So maybe that's already an interesting result of this lecture in that sense. So I'm happy to be here. What I want to do today is really not present anything like a finished or complete paper, but rather I will be presenting a unfinished thought process, which I hope to take you with me through this thought process, and therefore I'm also really curious to hear your questions, your thoughts, your maybe objections. I'm not sure. You will be the first audience for this thought process, so I'm very happy to see some familiar faces in this audience as well. So maybe I should start by saying something about this rather impenetrable title that I made, because I think it can explain what I want to do today. So there is these 3 concepts that I want to be relating, and those are Hometactics, atmospheric care, and agonistic realism. And I found them in the work of Mariana Ortéga, Michael Vine, and Honig most explicitly. So I will be discussing 3 papers by them. But if I'm more precise, I'm actually trying to discuss 2 examples of what I want to call agonistic care politics. And those 2 examples are Hometactics and atmospheric care. And agonistic care politics is something of a web that I'm trying to construct between the work of Honig, which is agonistic realism or virtue politics, which I will be actually saying more about today, and Puig de Bellacasa, who is a science and technology philosopher. Okay, so that's kind of the web that I'm in, but now the question is, of course, why? Well, because I hope to find in their interrelation a way to think about politics in face of the climate crisis. So that's really the context that I work from, and that's also where I want to start. Because I think that the climate crisis, well, it undeniably poses a lot of problems, challenges, struggles on almost all fronts, but it also poses some philosophical questions. And one way of looking at these questions, I think, is to see how the climate crisis shows that some dichotomies that we know from Plato, from modern thinking, that these dichotomies really are untenable, have been untenable, but the climate crisis makes it really, really clear that they are untenable. So let me start there. That is, I think that if we look at, for example, the dichotomy of thinking humans as something different than animals, the climate crisis shows us that in many ways, humans are animals, right? We will go extinct also at some point. We are dependent on ecologies, on biodiversity, on our relations in this system. And we are also in that sense physical beings and not only minds. So we might have this kind of this idea of this pyramid, right, with humans on top and then animals under it and then plants under that and then maybe some soils under that. But what the climate crisis, I think, shows us is that human beings really aren't that exceptional or removed from the rest of the world that we're living in. And at the same time, that we're really not only conscious walking computers, but that we're embodied beings in the world, and that we need to think that or to take that with us in our thinking. All right, so the same happens with the dichotomy between culture and nature, or human environments and natural environments. So you see in the climate crisis that we as humans live in the natural world, and that culture may be in many ways also a natural phenomenon, but also we see that many so-called natural environments are in some way cultured or cultivated, so that the trying to maintain this distinction kind of limits us rather than that it helps us think further, think about futures, think about politics in face of the climate crisis. Now, of course, in this context in SWIP, I don't want to leave unmentioned that what we see resonating here are also those dichotomies between traditionally male and traditionally female characteristics, or the way that we characterize men and women. So you see that we have the rational man who is conscious and a thinking, cultured being, versus the female emotional being who is identified with her body and with nature much more. And these dichotomies, I think, what they show us is that if we want to think about futures, about possible futures in face of the climate crisis, that we need to unlearn and unthink these ways of characterizing the world. And that means that we don't only need to unlearn to think about man dominating nature, but also to stop thinking in terms of man protecting nature or the earth, or man saving nature or the earth, right? Because these are really, in that sense, perpetuations of the same ways of thinking. So even though it's a different narrative, these dichotomies still uphold in the idea that we as human beings, or as human race, will save the earth or will solve the climate crisis. So that's kind of the context that I wanted to start with. And so I'm schooled as a political philosopher. And what I want to do really in my research, but I want to take some steps today, is to think about politics and political philosophy in face of these challenges that the climate crisis poses to us. And what I think is interesting is to see that it's not necessarily, or it's not really traditional political philosophy, but rather science and technology studies or new materialisms as philosophical fields in which we find the most interesting conceptualizations of what politics might mean in this challenge to unlearn or rethink these modern dichotomies. So these are two pictures that relate to, on the left side, the work of Latour, and on the right, the work of Donna Haraway, which some of you might know. But I think that even though they're elaborations on what politics might mean if we stop thinking man over and against nature, they do not include usually a political philosophy, in the sense that it engages with what we usually understand politics to be, just in colloquial understanding of politics, right? So how do we combine, or how do we connect this idea of Haraway of making string figures with our democratic system, with our representative democracy? That's a really, really big step to take, and I'm not going to solve that in this lecture, but I do want to kind of take 2 steps in one possible direction of starting to connect these 2 fields. So what I want to do in the remainder of this lecture is to take 2 steps with the idea to think about how to react, how to think about the future in face of the climate crisis. And the first step is to think about rethinking our relations, our human relations with environments, with non-human environments, with non-human natural and unnatural environments. And the second step, which is a lot shorter than this one, will be to connect that back to a political philosophy, which I find in Honig. All right, so I actually want to start with a psychological text written by Susan Clayton in 2003, and Susan Clayton is developing this concept of an environmental identity, which she thinks will be or might be kind of a motor or a mobilizer towards pro-environmental behavior. So I think it's interesting to start here because it's psychology, because it's really kind of 2 feet on the ground type of thinking. So let's start there, and I need to adjust. Yeah. I will, from now on, I will be reading a lot of quotes, so stay with me. And don't fret, you don't need to read them while I'm talking. All right. Because the social aspects of identity are so obvious and so important, psychologists often overlook the impact of non-social, or at least non-human, objects in defining identity. Yet there are clearly many people for whom an important aspect of their identity lies interior to the natural world. Connections to specific natural objects, such as pets, trees, mountain formations, or particular geographic locations. This is not limited to those who are labeled environmentalists. Many who are associated with positions that are considered anti-environmental nevertheless demonstrate through words or behavior their love of some aspects of the natural world. Right, so what I find so interesting in this paper is that Clayton here takes identity and a certain type of identification that she sees both in environmentalists and in conservatives or anti-environmental people, and she takes that as a starting point for thinking about pro-environmental behavior. She's working towards this concept that she calls environmental identity, which really says, as human beings, we have specific parts of the natural world that we, for example, grow up with. So a tree that was in your childhood garden, or these mountain formations that you looked out on every day, and you tend to identify, or some people identify themselves with these parts of nature. And what Clayton is saying, this identification makes you prone to want to take care of that specific part of the natural world, right? So because you care about that tree that was in your garden, you are prone to want to protect it from being cut down. And she says, well, this is actually a really interesting starting point. If we could start from these identifications with parts of the natural non-human world and kind of connect it to bigger or larger struggles for taking care of the natural world, right? And she sees that as something that might inspire both environmentalists on the one hand, but also conservatives or anti-environmentalists on the other hand. So I think this really resonates with a lot of different kinds of people. For example, I was teaching the climate crisis, a course at EUC, and many of my students readily started talking about, and I had this creek where I always used to swim, and now it's being polluted, and it really maddens me and it saddens me to see that, and I really want to fight for it. So I think that this is a really interesting thing about this proposition of an environmental identity that Clayton does. But there are also some problematic aspects. I think two are most important here. The one is that we see, of course, echoing here this dichotomy between this distinction between non-human natural environments and non-human, non-natural or cultural environments. And the other one is that I think it focuses a lot on the individual, and it has this rather open-ended perspective of that identity in some way is connected to pro-environmental behavior, but it doesn't really tell us how identity will bring this effect about, or how we might use this idea of identity having an influence. But more importantly, so on the first problem, I think that we should ask, what is so specific about this type of relating to the natural non-human environment, and how is it different from ways of relating to the non-human, non-natural environment? And Clayton herself says some things about that. That is, she says, well, there are effects of being in the natural world, such as the calming effect of, walking in the forest, or the feeling of being able that you get if you spend a lot of time in nature, and we just don't get those feelings or those capacities when we stick with a fully human world. But even though I tend to recognize what she's saying here, I'm not sure whether these connections, or whether this specifically is foundational for the potential that I see here between, on the one hand, this way of relating to your environment, and on the other hand, the pro-environmental concern or behavior. So I think that if we want to think about politics in face of the unlearning and the rethinking that we need to do in face of the climate crisis, then we might ask questions about how do we as humans relate to our environments, but without perpetuating this differentiation between natural and cultural environments. And that point really brings me to this book written by Maria Puig de la Bellacasa, Matters of Care, and she works in the tradition of Haraway, of Latour, that I mentioned before. And this is a beautiful book. I can recommend it to everyone. Puig de la Bellacasa is here bringing together the field of feminist politics of care with this science and technology work on knowledge production and on ways of relating to non-human environments. And what I think is interesting about this book within the confines of this lecture is how care, as presented by Puig de la Bellacasa, could be a way to give direction to this open-endedness that I identified in Clayton's proposal, whilst also bringing together these natural and non-natural environments. So let's start by reading a little bit. All right. Relations of care can take different meanings, but in all of them, we also become involved with the matters of facts and the matters of concern. Ways of knowing or caring re-affect objectified worlds, restage things in ways that generate possibility for other ways of relating and living, connect things that we're not supposed to be connecting across the bifurcation of consciousness, and ultimately transform things, and ultimately transform the ethical, political, and effective perception of things by involvement in the mattering of worlds. All right, so a lot is happening already in this short piece of text. But what I think or what I want to address is how relations of care, according to Puig and Bellacasa, connect us or involve us with those things that we find in our environments, or in this piece of text, those things that we are studying as scientists. But apart from this connection or involvement, things also really start to change. So she says, right, formerly objective worlds start to enter affective relations. Other ways of relating and living are supposedly being generated, and connections are made that were deemed impossible or that weren't seen before. So I think that before we can really understand what this means, we need to dive into what she actually means by care here. And that brings me to this next quote. Caring in this context is both a doing and ethical political commitment that affects the way we produce knowledge about things. It goes beyond a moral disposition or wishful thinking. Here, care stands for necessary yet mostly dismissed labors of everyday maintenance of life, an ethico-political commitment to neglected things, and the effective remaking of relationships with our objects. Okay, so if we follow Puig de Bellacasa, we might just turn our attention to those everyday ways of maintaining everyday life. Those necessary but often dismissed labors and ways of tending to neglected things, in order to find their ways of relating to non-human, natural, and cultural environments, and ways of relating to them that could generate possibilities for other ways of relating and living. And this is where I find the politics in here, right? In this generation of these possibilities. So I want to go more concrete. And I found two texts, these two concepts that are in the title, that I think are really good examples, really incredibly inspiring examples in the way that they relate exactly these kinds of necessary and mostly dismissed everyday labors of politics they give examples exactly of these kinds of practices, of these kinds of activities. So the first one that I want to discuss is a text by Michael Vine. He's an anthropologist. And in 2019, he wrote this article in which he analyzes how in the Owens Valley, which you see here in California, parents of children with respiratory diseases fight to keep out the sand and the dust in this valley. And in this article, he develops this notion of atmospheric care. So the Owens Valley is a region in California, there I said, but it formerly included a great lake. Yet this was, a lot of the natural water supply was extracted and exported to the city of Los Angeles, and therefore a lot of the big part of the second half of the 20th century, you had these huge dust storms over the riverbed, so to say. And with the historic droughts that California has been going through, again, you see these dust storms happening. And what you see there is many of the residents suffer from dust-aggravated respiratory diseases. Even though this hasn't been epidemiologically researched in any formal setting, it does seem to be very recognizable as an effect of this ecological degradation. All right, so these parents of children with asthma, with respiratory diseases, they are fighting fine-grained particulate matter, right? And how do they do that? Well, with activities such as cleaning much more often and with different materials such as vinegar instead of harsh cleaning products, or taking out carpets and putting in wooden floors, or taking out all the houseplants. So these are extensions of household labor, household work, and they take place in the context of the family. They take place in the context of the home. Yet they go beyond kind of love and affection and really resemble more professional caretaking practices towards these children that need breathable environments. Also, they're quite obviously related to these politics of ecological degradation. And you see here echoing politics of gender household relations. So you see that a lot of women are usually working these activities. Now, what I think is very interesting is that Michael Vine is describing how these parents fight a natural, volatile force, but he's not describing a fight against, an outside enemy, or constructing barriers against, the evil that goes on outside. Rather, he's recognizing careful practices that he calls positive air conditioning. So he's looking at how careful practices are involved with, and he says, with actively nourishing human life by cultivating rather than curtailing the air's breathability. So, as I said, this is not necessarily about love and affection, but it's about action. It's about practices. And in that way, these practices of atmospheric care materialize the social and emotional relations in the household situation by repairing, remaking, restructuring, relating, all those kinds of things. Now, these relations, of course, primarily have their place within the house, but they also extend beyond it. And this is what I want to read about in this next quote. After a moment of silence, a middle-aged woman introduced herself as a concerned mother before asking a question about the dry lake bed and its dust storms, which she claimed had gotten worse again after many years of relative calm, perhaps as a result of California's so-called historic drought. Discussing triggers in the home is all well and good, the woman continued, but does not amount to much if her son cannot play outside with his friends without the threat of an attack. Confused by what I presume she considered to be an off-topic comment, however, the nurse simply ignored the woman's question and attempted to guide the conversation back towards the matter at hand. So what you see happening here is the domestication of this disaster that we see in this Owens Valley, right? It's the nurse reacting to the question of the mother as if what's happening in the house, so the breathability of air and the keeping the house clean, is something disconnected from the drought that's going on outside, from these ecological questions, from these ecological practices. And of course, if these practices are in some way supposed to inform a politics in face of the climate crisis, we would hope that they go beyond the household sphere in some way. And this is what Vine works towards in the second half of his article, where he speaks to this mother, Julia, mother of a teenage son with asthma, who complements her household works, or as she calls them, experiments with the atmospheric elements of everyday life, with activist practices. So she's talking to officials, she's attending workshops and protests, she's signing and going around with petitions, all these kinds of things. But these activist practices that she's involved with are supposed to, or she's involved with them, to politicize these practices of the household and these practices that are going on within these houses in the valley, and to connect them in that sense to the struggles in different homes, but also in different regions. And Vine really recognizes how these de-domesticated acts of atmospheric care are only an extension of the domesticated acts of atmospheric care to Julia, for example. So she sees them as two parts of the same thing, as two ways of taking care of her environment, and with that, her son. So just to kind of relate it back to this topic of non-human elements in politics, because here, of course, you could also say, isn't she just taking care of her son? Most importantly, I want to read this this next quote, in which you see the non-human elements and the role that they play here. Right. The mundane materials of everyday life, such as food, water, and air, function as critical nodes in the constitution of biological and social life that bring people otherwise separated by geographic and historic circumstances into close communion with one another, as well as with the world around them, albeit in ways that are shaped by the relations of power and inequality in which they are embedded. All right, so I hope you agree with me that you see a really clear example of a politics of care here in this article by Vine. And at the same time, you might say, so this is very particular to people living in heavily polluted environments. And this is one of the reasons why I want to move on to this second example by Mariana Ortéga. It's one of the contributions in this book, 50 Concepts for a Critical Phenomenology. And Ortéga proposes the concept of Hometactics. So they're really, really different contexts than we were in before. Now, Ortéga starts this article from the notion that homes which should be familiar are for some people really not that familiar. And she explains it very well herself. So let's start reading first. In the absence of a home of the type that appears in movies, books, and myths, one that is nurturing and in which we find ourselves at ease, we engage in practices that allow us to feel comfortable and to get a sense of belonging in various spaces, including ones that are not welcoming or that highlight membership in communities with whom we don't share identity markers. So you can see this is a different context. It's a phenomenology, and Ortéga is here pointing to the lived experiences of what she calls multiplicitous selves, and those are those people that find themselves simultaneously being in worlds and being in between worlds because they take on different positionalities through the intersections of class, race, nationality, gender, ability, all these kinds of things. So she says these multiplicitous selves, they don't find this home, this self-evidence of feeling of a feeling of belonging in a certain city, in a certain home, in a certain environment, and they need to make that happen, or they need to create that feeling of belonging through what she calls Hometactics. And she reads de Certeau to get some examples, but also because de Certeau undervalues, I think, the strength of these Hometactics. De Certeau provides examples of tactics in the figure of the migrant who makes do in her new city by being creative, the cook who improvises recipes, the street walker that makes the city hers precisely by walking it. Yet the so-called weak in de Certeau's discussion, end up demonstrating a strength, creativity, and adaptability that the strategist may not achieve. So even though Ortéga explicitly does not want to formulate a politics of location or relation, she really wants to talk about this phenomenological process. We find again here these practices, which I think could be in a way seen as care practices, right? It's taking care of your environment and of your own belonging in that environment, of your relations with your environments. And these relations between the self and the environment, again, play a really important role also politically. What is interesting, I think, to bring in here is, and that's actually introduced by Fielding, someone else in the same book, and she refers to how Ortéga shows this to be the case. In a phenomenological context, you could say, well, Ortéga shows how a rupture in the self-evident feeling of being in the world, this you know, entering a room and knowing that you belong, a rupture in that self-evident quality thereof provides a critical opportunity. And that critical opportunity is that we are on the one hand possibly better able to recognize which power structures are at play, but on the other hand also that when this feeling of belonging falls away, we are prompted to act upon our environments and tend to them. And here we see again this care practices. These care practices, two words are environments, two words are human and non-human environments taking place. And in that sense, and I think this is working towards a conclusion, although there is really one more step to take, I'm curious to see whether the climate crisis, and then I really mean the noticeable or everyday effect of the climate crisis, could present a rupture, such a rupture in the self-evident belonging to our environments. And maybe if we start noticing or if we learn to notice these effects more pronouncedly, then it could also rupture our self-evident belonging, even in Western, privileged, white, rich contexts, right? So this is kind of something that I'm trying out, and I'm not sure yet how convincing it is, or if it will, stick with me. But I think something could be happening here. All right. Now, with this very tentative statement in mind, I want to move on to this very last step that I want to take, and that is to robe in really very briefly the agonistic politics that I find in the work of Bonnie Honig. And I wanted to relate it to her agonistic realism, but because of time and preparation time most precisely, I want to address only her notion of virtue politics. And this is something that she develops in her 1997 work, Political Theory and Displacement of Politics, where she very, very crudely differentiates between, on the one hand, politics as rational system building in which a certain type of citizen, through certain types of formalized practices, functions within a system, and that's what politics is. And on the other hand, virtue politics, which she defines at some point as the perpetuity of contest, or as politics as an open-ended struggle. So let's read one last quote, which is by Bonnie Honig, about these virtue politics. To affirm the perpetuity of contest is not to celebrate a world without points of stabilization. It is rather to affirm the reality of perpetual contest, even within an ordered setting, and to identify the affirmative dimensions of contestation. It is to see that the always imperfect closure of political space tends to engender remainders, and that if those remainders are not engaged, they may return to haunt and destabilize the very closures that deny their existence. Right, so you'll readily recognize that the language here is a lot different, and there is a lot to say about differences between the context of Honig and, for example, Puig de Bellacasa, but I really also see very interesting and strong connections. Those are, for example, if you think back of the quote that we read from de la Bellacasa, where she suggested that practices of care generate other possible ways of relating and living, which is in a way maybe exactly an embodied and practical way of keeping the agon open, of keeping political contest open. So in that sense, I think Honig could be a way to start better understanding how these domesticated practices could relate to bigger political struggles, to struggles of ecological degradation, as we see both Vine and Ortéga referring to, both of them refer to these bigger political struggles, but maybe Honig can really, with Honig, we could really kind of give it a place within an idea of politics and of political theory that is more closely related to how we usually think about politics. Yeah, so I think this is what I have for you today. Thank you, and I will stop sharing.
Great, beautiful, Sophie. Thank you very much. I'll immediately move to the chat. Before we start asking questions about you being the first female premier, Jasper, a few people were talking about the circle theory. Diana, oh, she just left, I see. Bart Koster, you had a comment. Can you explain a bit more about your comment? Oh, people left.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm still here. The quote from Clayton reminded me of that a concern for our direct natural environment can maybe engender concern for the broader natural environment and climate politics. That reminded me of I think it's from Peter Singer, but I don't know for sure, about the expanding circle of concern that most people care about what's right in front of them. But if you somehow can make them realize the similarities between those people and people all over the world, then their circle of concern will expand, and that's the way to generate more, well, worldwide solidarity or something.
Does that connect to your vision, the theory you've just been showing us, Sophie?
Yeah, it definitely does. I didn't know it was called the expanding circle of concern, but I wrote it down. Very interesting. But indeed, you of course have this whole school of thinking, I think, in which ethicists most predominantly are trying to think about how can we expand solidarity, right, towards, for example, also other humans on the other side of the globe, and in that sense, it is connected indeed. But what might be difficult with that is that what I'm actually trying to do is, in a way, also to bring politics closer to home. Instead of saying we need to expand our circle, I'm trying to say, no, actually this circle is taking place in, really, really closely related to yourself as a human being, but also as a part of these ecologies, a part of these environments. So that's, I think, a different take on trying to work towards a similar goal in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you. Does that answer your, well, not question, but comment, Bart? Yes? And I'd like to move on to the next question. Let's see. Catharina Koekoek, what was your question?
Yeah, thanks so much. And really nice to see you here, Sophie. And I really enjoyed your lecture. So thanks. I basically have two questions, and maybe I run the risk of sort of looking at your talk a bit too much through my own lens, right? But we'll see about that. So I guess one question I have, and I think it ties in with the relationship between agonist realism and sort of care practices, is that sometimes it seems to me as if in thinking about sort of new materialist care practices, it is evident what to do sort of in relationship to, I don't know, problems, but or like, but I can imagine that it is actually far from evident what to do, right? Like depending on your specific positionality and, I don't know, political orientation or whatnot, you might have very, very different ways of engaging with sort of, I don't know, the ruptured realities that you find yourself in. And I wonder sort of if you think that, I don't know, it seems to me that you think that this notion of care also has a sort of very strong normative sense in a way, that it's the right way of doing something, right? But I was wondering if you would like to expand on that. And then I have a sort of very, I guess, related question, which is that you were talking about this moment of rupture in relationship also to this idea of home tactics, right? And that if we are not at home, there is this rupture, and that has a political potentiality. And I can fully imagine that, but then at the same time, working on from a political perspective on post-truth myself, I can also see that we are very much living through a rupture, but the response to that rupture is very often a very careless and troublesome response. So I wonder if you could expand on sort of the political dangers of care as, I don't know, or maybe not care, but like of this idea of rupture.
Yeah, I think these are two very interesting and very important points that you're pointing towards. So on the one hand, actually in the work of Bonnie Honig, for example, you already see that she also engages with care ethics and the normativity of care ethics. And how she describes it, she says something like, I mean, she doesn't use the word smothering, but that's the feeling that I got. Like, if I just cuddle you really, really well, then the world will become a better place. And this is, of course, kind of a danger that is involved with this, I think also the word care, right? And all the associations that we have with it. But what Puig de la Bellacasa is actually trying to do is to not develop a normative notion of care, but rather to see it as ethics taking place in different places in different ways. So I think it's in that sense good to hear that you recognize this normativity in how I talk about it, because I think that's something that needs to go out more. Because of course I do have opinions about how I think we should care for our environments, but that's not what I think these care practices should be doing. I'm not trying to develop a notion of this is how we should care for the world around us. So there's a tension there, and I really want to dive deeper into that. And the same goes for this rupture. So of course, I think in many ways we are living through very careless times. If you see, for example, the SWIP-NL dilemma. I don't know if it's the same in Rotterdam, but in Amsterdam, definitely maybe 30% of the people has a swap fiets, but these bikes are living very, very short lives because people just kind of throw them around because it's not theirs, and therefore they don't need to care for it. So this carelessness, I think, is something that we really grew up with, and that we really also learned to embrace, and to think that that's okay, or that if we pay for a service, then we don't need to take care in any kind of way. So I totally agree with you that in many ways ruptures can, of course, provoke very different reactions, and that this is also a problem for politics in a time of climate crisis, and for politics in a time of post-truth. But what I'm hoping, in a sense, is that it does get to a reaction at the very least, you know, so that it does enter people's lives, and that it doesn't stay at the level of rational understanding that there is a problem that we should, or that the government should do something about. So this is what I hope to find there, and I acknowledge and agree with this danger there.
Thank you, Sophie. Does that answer your question, Catherine? Yeah, good, thank you. And the next in line is Sander Bauer. Perhaps this connects just to her answer. You emphasize shared experiences.
Yeah, it wasn't really a question. I've just been thinking about, so looking at COVID pandemic, you know, we try to focus only on the impact for our human society. But what's been noticeable to me, how much we stepped away from thinking about what ecological society has suffered due to our capitalist paradigm. Whilst indeed, Sophie also mentions quite carefully, like there is only a mental dichotomy. Nature has always been a part of us, and we have always been a part of nature, if we put it that way. So I think that indeed, as Bas Koster mentioned, like how do we make steps forward is to well, I always want to say aggressively address this specific point in public media, in poster campaigns, in socials, etc., etc. So yeah, that was just a trail of thought from my side.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to respond to that? Do you recognize what he's saying, Sophie?
Yeah. I mean, I agree. Let's make a poster campaign about the human and the natural world being one and the same world, and I think that kind of making people more aware of these relations would be a really good thing, kind of independent from specifically the climate crisis, but also in relation to it. So definitely, thanks.
Good, thank you. Okay, Jasper asks us, if you were the first female premier of this country, what would be your first step to put it into practice? Now, of course, this is a funny question. On the other hand, I think practice is a very interesting concept. Like, how would you put this into practice if you were to strive for a politics of care?
Oh, if I was the first female premier?
Well, not necessarily. I think that's most a joke, but how to put this into practice is an interesting question, I'd say.
Very, very good question. I also really wouldn't know yet. So my thought process on this is only starting. No, maybe the poster campaign that Sander talked about is a good starting point. I mean, I think there would be so many things to do regarding already these dichotomies, right? Which is, I think, really a starting point for a lot broader type of misunderstandings that keep being perpetuated throughout media, throughout public discourse. And I think it could be a good start to wonder there. But I don't have a political program yet.
I assume so, yeah. Well, officially we have 1 minute left. I never mind if it's 10 minutes longer, but a last question at least for Lisbeth. What was your question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie. This was a very, very interesting and wide-ranging talk. And I actually have 2 questions. I'm going to keep them very short, and one whataboutism. And the questions are attempts to re-articulate the points that Catherine actually raised in such an eloquent manner. So the first point would be concerning the normative status of care. So I think indeed there's a very intuitive way of thinking of care as something good, right? But we also have a long tradition of feminist critiques that actually try to demystify care and basically show how care has also been allocated to the wrong things, to the wrong practices. Care both as an effect but also as a practice, right? And how that actually reproduces very problematic social relations as well as exploitation of the environment and groups of people. So I'm wondering if you could expand perhaps on that, like what are the limits of care? Is care always good, or are there indeed forms of care that we should desperately get rid of? And the other point is something that Catherine touched on with regard to her question about the unfamiliarization, right? As an opening up, like almost this epistemological and hopefully also political point of view from which we can start to challenge stuff. So what I really like about your paper is that it goes all over in the most positive sense of the word. Like you get together resources from all different kind of disciplines. And I think this is exactly what we need to tackle such an interdisciplinary problem, so to speak, such as climate change, environmental change in a political context such as the one we live in. But I was wondering, if we take serious the idea of unfamiliarization, doesn't that exactly go against the point of Clayton, that we try to identify ourselves with our natural environment? Because that seems to presuppose, that sense of identification seems to presuppose a familiarity. And it sometimes almost seems to presuppose a very static notion of identity, right? Like you said, you don't have to be an environmentalist. You can just love Mount Rushmore and be a cowboy and exploit the country in whatever way possible. And it doesn't require a moment of defamiliarization. So I'm wondering if you could bounce these points off to one another. And I don't think you have to make a clear-cut decision for either one of them. I think someone like Iris Marion Young makes a very clear case that, you know, we can cherry pick whatever we need for our specific political goal. But perhaps you can, in the 1 minute left, elaborate on that. And then the whataboutism is, what about Bill Connolly? So of course, when we think about the Anthropocene, or perhaps the Capitalocene and politics, he's one of the key authors nowadays, very much closely in line with Bonnie Honig as well. And he would respond to your very first comment about what do we do with representative democracy? He would be like, who cares about representative democracy? We need to swarm. We need to come together and engage in a collective action that is not masterminded or that is not guided by anyone. So these are my 3 questions / comments, but mostly thank you very much.
Yeah, I think I can react to them in reverse order, actually. What about William Connolly? Well, I read his work a lot for my master thesis, and then it's now on my bedside table to read, right? I think he's a really interesting author, and just to kind of clarify, I'm not looking for a new political system or a new political systemic way of dealing with this. So in that sense, it's also difficult to relate it to what about representative democracy, or what if you would be the premier of the Netherlands. Then your second question about familiarity or unfamiliarity and Clayton, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that it might point to, on the one hand, what's difficult in Clayton, which is she really wants to work from almost a feeling of nostalgia towards, you know, your childhood tree, and connect that to, or mobilize that in environmental movements. And in that sense, I do think it's a really interesting starting point, but I really don't think that this will be enough to work with. And I think that where it comes together is when your childhood tree, you know, is dying because of pollution, because of stickstoff, nitrogen pollution, or when the creek you always used to swim in can no longer be swum in because it's now full of chemicals or full of what's the well, the blauwalg, yeah, the algae that are in the water in the Netherlands, which are due to, right, really hot weather. So here they kind of come together, this unfamiliarization, coming into these environments that we identify with, and that therefore also leads to this rupture, and to the fact that this rupture might actually hurt us in some way, or aggravate us, or madden us. So that's how I kind of see the connection. But I agree with you that identity, I think, is not the best kind of way to throw this political game. So I don't want to go into a kind of political identity politics type of discourse. Last, or your first question was about the limits of care and the demystification of care. And this is, on the one hand, something that I need to dive deeper into. So you have, of course, the work of Joan Tronto also on really the politics of care, but you also have later work which is very critical of should we even continue using this paradigm. And I here, this is really where I now need to get further into, because what you already see in Vine, for example, is that he is talking to all these mothers that are caring for their children in very many ways, in which you could also think, so should we start celebrating this specifically in this way, because it could also just again identify mothers with household work, with childcare, with these very traditional practices, and that's really, I think, not the way to go. But how to navigate this, I don't know yet, so I hope to figure out. But thank you for your suggestions and questions.
Well, great. We're already 7 minutes over time. So I think we have to round off, unfortunately, because it seems like we could be definitely discussing for another hour, as I see it. But thank you very much, Sophie. That was wonderful, absolutely. And thank everyone who asked their questions, who joined the lecture. Please keep an eye, and now I'm promoting SWIP a bit, on the Society for Women in Philosophy, because we'll be continuing academic lectures. They will be always free online if that is the most comfortable situation, otherwise, if possible, and location. So keep on joining us. Thanks again, Sophie. Very well done.
Thank you.